The Men of Greywater Station is a story about a group of researchers on a planet that is entirely overrun by a hive mind fungus that psychically controls all of the life on itself. The fungus sends out spores that basically infect and turn any life form they find into a zombie. As you can imagine, that's a pretty stressful work environment, and it's made more stressful by the fact that a Federal Empire ship of soldiers has just crash landed, and they may soon come under the control of the fungus and attack the research base. It's a very psychologically driven story, and it's important to keep all of the 7 main characters apart. So I went ahead and commissioned a piece of art to act as sort of a visual aid here. And I'm really excited to show it to you guys. So this was made by Birdchest. It's awesome. They were awesome to work with, and there'll be a link to their profile in the description of the video. Go check them out. Thank you. So the first person I want to talk about is Jim Delveccio, the station leader. He's sort of a pragmatic, weary scientist, and he finds himself forced to act as a military strategist. He tries to prioritize logic over emotion as he ensures his crew's survival and manages all of their different personalities and trauma responses, as he makes sure the fungus does not get into the base or infect the soon-to-arrive supply ship. Delveccio is haunted by the loss of 2 members of his crew that occurred before the start of this story. Each decision he makes is going to take his crew further away from their mission and their humanity. Next, we'll talk about Bill Rain, the radar operator. He's the youngest crew member at Greywater Station, and he has thick black hair. He's optimistic, compassionate, impulsive. As the kid of the group, he's also a bit naive and willing to defy orders that he does not agree with. Rain is a romantic, and he wants to preserve his group's humanity and save as many lives as possible. He's quite possibly the only good character in this story, and he seems to always be at odds with Eldon Sheridan, the zoologist. Sheridan is described as bullet-headed. He's argumentative and cynical. He is secretly paralyzed by a deep-seated fear of the fungus that is preventing him from fulfilling his role as zoologist. He aggressively advocates for eliminating any survivors to protect the station and his sense of security. Ned Miters, the field researcher, is described as big and blonde and blocky with a drooping mustache. He is high-strung, nervous, and increasingly paranoid that the fungus is using the animals on the planet to clear a path for an assault by the survivors of the crash. I think it's interesting that the character that spends the most time outside of the base and probably has the best understanding of the planet's ecology is the most paranoid. As we'll see, it might not be paranoia. And his best friend is Bill Rain. Otis Sanderpay is the telecom and technical specialist. He's a thin-faced man with a gangle of long arms and legs and big red hands. He is resourceful and probably the most reliable member of the crew, although he does have a few lines that remind me of Dolorous Ed. By that, I mean he'll complain about things. Arnold Andrews is described as a quiet little man, and he is the mycologist. He is secretly engineering a virulent, non-intelligent mutation of the Greywater fungus for use as a biological weapon against the Findi. He also finds himself as the group's new demolitions expert, although he is unhappy about being taken away from his research. Ike Granowitz, the XT, that's extraterrestrial psychologist. He's described as wiry, and he's an intellectual. His motivation is to communicate with the virus. So, as you can imagine, he is quite upset to learn about their secret mission and Andrew's research. As the XT psychologist, Granowitz proposes that the fungus evolved from a single central point and expanded until it absorbed every animal and plant on the planet. He theorizes the fungus has never encountered another sentient being, and therefore it lacks any concept of another being or diplomacy. So that means he does not believe the fungus recognizes individual humans as intelligent. Instead, it sees the massive metal structure of the Greywater station itself as a rival hive mind. It basically sees the humans as unimportant tools or possibly parasites living inside the belly of its metal competitor. Granowitz believes the fungus is driven by a biological imperative to dominate all other life, and it treats the station as a threat to its monopoly over the planet. He notes that the fungus will attack extensions of the station, such as the flyers that they use to get around, but it often ignores individual humans unless they become annoying. He believes that when the fungus takes control of a new host and assimilates it, it absorbs at least a part of their knowledge and memories. So he's hopeful that if the fungus absorbs a human being and its brain, that the fungus will learn language and he'll be able to communicate with it and negotiate a ceasefire. So again, we can only imagine how devastated he is when he learns that his pure quest for knowledge and communication was being subverted in a front for a biological warfare project to essentially lobotomize the entity he was trying to understand and communicate with. I think it's important that we take a second here and think about that while the characters of the story don't think that the fungus is quite on the intellectual level that they are, they do admit that they continually underestimate its intelligence. So it's quite possible that the fungus may have absorbed one of the two crew members that were lost before the start of the story and actually fully well knows that the mission of the station is to effectively lobotomize it by removing its sentience to use it as a biological weapon in a quest for complete genocide of entire planets. So, yeah, the fungus is secretly the hero of the story. Our protagonists are definitely at least reminiscent of German World War II experiments. What? I'm trying not to get demonetized here. And I do actually think the YouTube censors might be unhappy with some of the words that have appeared in our script, especially on last week's episode. So I'm doing my best over here. I think you know what I mean. Our protagonists are not the good guys. Granowitz, at least, appears to be aware of the irony as he compares their defense to that of Werner von Braun's defense and eventual surrender of his military missile base in World War II for the Germans. Whether or not or how fully you agree with Granowitz's theory probably depends on how you interpret the dreams that Delveccio experiences, which you could see as an attempt at communication by the fungus. But before we talk about those dreams, there are two crew members that deceased before the start of the story that we should talk about. They are Blatt and Ryerson. We don't really know much about Blatt at all, but Ryerson is described as a small pot-bellied man, and he is their geologist. Ryerson and Blatt perished when a swamp bat flew into or attacked their flyer out in the swamps. I think it's important to note that their bodies were never recovered. Delveccio had trouble sleeping. He woke up at least twice between the sheets that were cold and sticky with sweat. In his nightmare, he was out beyond Greywater, knee-deep in the gray-green slime, collecting samples for analysis. While he worked, he watched a big amphibious mud tractor in the distance, wallowing toward him. On top was another human, his features invisible behind filter mask and skin thins. The dream Delveccio waved to the tractor as it neared, and the driver waved back. Then he pulled up nearby, climbing down from the cab, and grasped Delveccio in a firm handshake. Only by that time, Delveccio could see through the transparent filter mask. It was Ryerson, the dead geologist, his friend Ryerson, but his head was swollen grossly, and there were trails of fungus hanging from each ear. After the second nightmare, he gave it up as a bad show. They never found Ryerson or Blatt after the crash, though they knew from the impact that there wouldn't be much to find. But Delveccio dreamed of them often, and he suspected that some of the others did too. So his dead friend, Ryerson, who was possibly taken over by the fungus, shakes his hand, the universal sign of a peaceful greeting and mutual recognition and cooperation. I think that very well may suggest that, as Granowitz theorized, the fungus is attempting to communicate and even possibly cooperate. Now let's look at his second dream. He was old and cool. He saw the station from all sides in a shifting montage of images, some near the ground, some from above, wheeling on silent wings. In one image, he saw, or felt as a worm must feel, the presence of the heavy weight of sunlight. He saw the station twisted, old, wrecked. He saw the station in a series of images from inside. He saw a skeleton in the corner of an indefinite lab, and saw through the eyes of the skull out into the broken station. Outside, he saw heaped duralloy bodies with gray-green growths sprouting from the cracked faceplates. And he saw out of the faceplates, out into the swamp. Everywhere was gray-green and damp and old and cold. Everywhere. Delveccio awoke, sweating. When he feels old and cool, he's experiencing the sensation of being the fungus outside in the cold swamp as the only intelligence for a very long time. He also gets all sorts of different perspectives, which seem to be those of the swamp bats wheeling on silent wings, or one of the burrowing worms, as a worm must feel. These seem less like dreams and more like images projected directly into Delvecchio's mind by the fungus from the perspective of its various drones. It does also seem to be a prophetic dream, at least as far as the bodies are concerned. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that. And one other possible explanation is that Delvecchio's first dream was the fungus attempting to cooperate, and the second dream was more of a threat from the fungus, a sort of carrot and stick scenario, maybe? If you have a theory or you think you know, leave a comment. We took a break from it last week, but hey, now we get to talk about flora and fauna. We have the intelligent fungus, which is the dominant life form on the planet. It produces a constant blizzard of spores that infect and control all animal life. It is a gray-green slime or growth on the body of its hosts. There are various trees that grow in the swamp, some of which are overhung with parasitic creepers, particularly the gnarled trees that are almost petrified. Little interesting possible weirwood. I know that's something Preston Jacobs at least considered. Finally, there are those creepers that are parasitic vines that grow from and around the trees. For fauna, we have the swamp bats that are large aerial predators with 6-foot wingspans and razor-barbed tails. We have the slinkers Those are 4-foot long scaled lizards with claws. They're omnivores, and the fungus uses them to clear paths through the undergrowth. There are burrowing worms that attack the station's field from underground, various insects and arthropods that the fungus uses to attack the windscreen of vehicles and clog instruments on the station. Root snuffs, which are small, generally harmless animals that Granowitz has attempted to use to communicate with the fungus. And finally, hellions, large, black, leathery winged flyers that are twice the size of the swamp bats. They are native to mountains 1,000 miles away from the station. So, Greywater Station definitely sounds like a nightmare. But what if I told you it's actually on Nightmare? That's right. In another story, A Song for Leah, a character named Gustafsson has an ill-fated expedition to the planet Nightmare. And I think I can convince you that it's the same planet this story takes place on. In A Song for Leah, Leah, a telepath, says this about Gustafsson. He's got the slow plague, Rob, a terminal case. It's been eating at him from inside for 15 years now. He got it back on Nightmare, in the swamps, when his family died. That's no world for people, but he was there, the administrator over a research base, a short-term thing. They lived on Thor. It was only a visit, but the ship crashed. Gustafsson got all wild and tried to reach them before the end, but he grabbed a pair of faulty skin thins. And the spores got through, and they were all dead when he got there. He had an awful lot of pain, Rob, from the slow plague, but more from the loss. He really loved them, and it was never the same after. I could see the picture, Rob. It was vivid. He couldn't forget it. The kids were inside the ship, safe behind the walls, but the life system failed and choked them to death. But his wife, oh, Rob, she took some skin thins and tried to go for help. And outside, those things, those big wrigglers they have on Nightmare. I swallowed hard, feeling a little sick. The eater worms? I said dully. I'd read about them and seen hollows. I could only imagine the picture that Lai had seen in Gustafsson's memory, and it wasn't at all pretty. I was glad that I didn't have her talent. They were still when Gustafsson got there, he killed all of them with a screech gun. Both worlds appear to be extremely hostile swamps that require the use of skin thins. Both worlds have a research base in a swamp with something that releases spores and screech guns. I think both worlds have similar fauna. The eater worms and big wrigglers could very easily be the burrowing worms or the giant leeches from the Men of Greywater Station, or something that could have evolved in the time that it takes between this story and when A Song for Leah is set, which is much later, after the interregnum. There is an apparent contradiction, but I think we can resolve it, namely that the fungus found in the Men of Greywater Station is hyper-aggressive and takes over the body and assimilates the mind of its victim within 72 hours. And the slow plague of A Song for Leah has taken over 15 years to kill Phil Gustafsson and does not seem to have, taken over his mind. But let's remember that Arnold Andrews is secretly breeding a, quote, mutation of the fungus, a non-intelligent variety, very virulent, very destructive of its hosts. It doesn't say how long it takes to destroy its hosts. In fact, if you wanted to cripple an enemy in war, it might be preferable to have a disease that placed a logistical burden on its society by simply torturing its victims. And I think the Federal Empire are exactly the kind of people that would develop a weapon like that. But you're saying is there any proof that they did work on that virus after the base was lost? And I say yes. Because in Call Him Moses, Havlin Tuff threatens to release a number of viruses. Quote, anthrax, Ryerson's disease, rose rot, choleracy, boils. That's Ryerson, the character who disappeared after a crash in the swamp in the story we're currently talking about. Tuff is in control of an old seed ship, which would be developed after this story, but before the collapse in Interregnum. That's a giant spaceship used for biological warfare, and something called Ryerson's disease is in its databanks. A Song for Leah takes place between these two stories. So I propose that either a secondary Federal Empire mission, or quite possibly even Gustafsson himself, led an effort to complete Arnold Andrews' original research, and they named it after Ryerson for some reason. And I think that the result is more colloquially known as the Slow Plague. I do think it's interesting that in this scenario, Gustafsson would have been sent to administer one planet with a hive mind to another planet with a different hive mind. I think the Empire is very interested in hive mind research, and I'll have more to say about that in other episodes. Next, I want to analyze Delvecchio's decisions in this story. So, decision number 1, he decides to forego a rescue attempt of the crashed troop transport. He reasons that the survivors are heavily armed soldiers who, if they are infected by the fungus, would become basically controlled and therefore weapons capable of breaching the station. And he's also afraid to send out his flyers because of the loss that occurred earlier due to the swamp bats. This decision will be detrimental to the cohesion of his group. It will morally outrage Bill Rain and increase Sheridan's fear, leading the two to argue and even draw other members of the crew into their fight. In an effort to de-escalate the tensions, Delveccio will order a rest for 6 hours and await the return of Meidertz and Sanderpay, and then resume their decision-making process. Delveccio does this because he believes his crew is too tired and emotional to think clearly. However, the delay heightens Rain's sense of urgency, because after 6 hours, the soldiers will just be that much more likely to be infected by the fungus, ultimately leading him to defy orders and cause his desertion, as Rain will use this time to escape with a flyer and medical supplies for the survivors. Rain's flyer will be attacked by swamp bats and insects and will go down. The crew and Delveccio believe Rain has died. Believing that Rain has been assimilated by the fungus, they are now fearful that it understands human military strategy and their plans specifically. Again, this will heighten the paranoia of the crew. Delvecchio's next decision is to move the base to what he calls a military footing, ordering all of his crew to focus on the development of weapons for their self-defense. This decision will lead to a dehumanization of the crew, because as scientists, they resent being turned into killers. Although Ned, who must be devastated by the loss of his best friend Rain, does seem to cope by focusing on the defense of the station, as he goes out with Delveccio to rig the trees into traps. Unfortunately, Ned witnesses the slinkers chew through the undergrowth away from the base, leading him to probably correctly theorize that the fungus is clearing a path for the advancing soldiers. Doesn't help that the slinkers then begin knocking over the trees that they had set up as traps. Next, fearing that if the station hull is breached or the power fails, that the cultures within the station could infect the crew before the enemy even reaches them, he orders the immediate destruction of all biological samples and animals within the station, as well as issuing an order to wear skin thins and filter masks inside the base with no reprieve. I don't know if you remember how annoying surgical masks were during COVID. This would be an extremely stressful order to obey. These decisions further strip the station and its men of their scientific purpose. This removes the anchor that has kept the men grounded and leaves them with nothing but their weapons and their fear to sit with as they wait for an inevitable assault. When a lone man is sighted approaching the base, Delveccio decides to leave the safety of the station in a mud tractor to confront him. Despite his orders to kill everything, he feels compelled to see if the survivors can still be reached or if they have already been lost to the fungus. The crew, especially Sheridan, begin to panic when Delveccio opens the door to leave. To make matters worse, he discovers that this man is infected with the fungus, confirming in the minds of his crew that all of the humans are infected. This leads to Delvecchio's final order, which is to hit the approaching force with everything at once. This causes the crew to enter a state of clinical slaughter. Instead of looking for any signs that the survivors might not be infected, they assume that they all are. Despite Granowitz's bombs and Sanderpay's repurposed sounding missiles, the base is overrun by both the soldiers and the controlled animals. Delveccio, the only survivor of the assault, will find Bill Rain alive, but dying, where he learns that Rain had actually successfully vaccinated the soldiers, and they were attempting to surrender their weapons when the station and its crew began slaughtering them, forcing them to return fire. In truth, only a handful of the soldiers had been exposed to the fungus, and they had been disarmed before the virus had a chance to take them over. Ultimately, Delvecchio's decisions, driven by a sense of pragmatism and fear and a series of tragic misunderstandings, lead to the annihilation of his crew and the soldiers. All right, let's talk etymology. Jim is from the Hebrew word for Jacob, meaning supplanter or one that follows, and Delvecchio is from an Italian word meaning of the old or old man. I suppose as the leader, he's kind of the old man of the group. Bill comes from the Germanic word for will or desire or protection, and that's exactly what Rain is. He acts as a protector of the humanity and humans in this story. Rain sounds like rain, and that could mirror his death in the rains of the storm that is going on as the base is attacked. Rain dies in the rain. Eldon comes from Old English words meaning old hill, and Sheridan means a seeker or searcher. I think this is one of those names that is used ironically. As a scientist and a zoologist, he should be seeking knowledge, but his fear leaves him paralyzed and unmoving as an old hill, unable to perform his work or even touch the infected fauna. Ike is derived from the Hebrew name Yitzchak for Isaac. It means he who laughs. And Granowitz comes from a Slavic root meaning border or boundary. And that could relate to his role as a psychologist working on the boundary between human and alien intelligence. Arnold comes from Germanic words meaning eagle power. Andrews is ultimately Greek in origin and means man, but also manly. So this is a very ironic name, Eagle Power Manly Man, for the smallest member of the group. He does, however, through his fungus, have the power to end entire worlds. Ned is actually a diminutive of Edward, meaning wealthy guardian, and he does act as a guardian of the station, while Miterts might come from the word miter, and in this case, I imagine it might be like a miter joint, an intersection of two things, in this case, reflecting his work at the boundary of the station where it meets the hostile wilds. Otis has Germanic origins, meaning wealth or fortune. I think Sanderpay is ultimately related to the diminutive of Alexander, which is Sander, meaning defender or protector of men. Otis Sanderpay does have some practical ingenuity in making wealth as he repurposes the station's gear into weapons to protect them. Blatt comes from a German word for leaf, and I believe Ryerson comes from a Dutch name, Reijersen, meaning army council. So these names reflect their deaths in the swamp and possibly are another hint that Ryerson has been absorbed by the fungus, and he's actually how the fungus is able to plan an assault on the base with Ryerson's military council. I wanted to put the etymology there because it was at this point I noticed that we have a Jacob and an Isaac from the Bible. And then thinking about it further, I realized the story takes place over 7 days. So maybe this is some sort of biblical allegory, like the 7 days of destruction or something. So, there's an omen on day 1 of the transport ship as a shooting star, and then they spend days 2 through 6 disassembling their creations on the station, destroying their scientific experiments to build weapons. And then on the final day, instead of a day of rest, there's a final assault, a breach of the station, and they all die. And instead of a rainbow, a cloud of spores appears in the sky. With the names and the 7 days, I really think there's something going on. Delveccio, like Jacob, wrestles with decisions, not an angel, and his attempts to keep all of his men working together and defeat the fungus. Isaac means he who laughs, and Ike does give a bitter chuckle when he realizes that his quest for communication was just a front for biological warfare. And in a way, Jim Delvecchio, the Jacob stand-in, orders the destruction of Isaac's life's work. I know the father and son are kind of reversed in this scenario, and it's Jacob instead of Abraham making the sacrifice. And Ike does die. So this could be, a twist on the story of Jacob and Isaac. The fungal hive mind does act perhaps as a sort of god, something we will explore more in A Song for Leah. But I don't know. I think something biblical is going on here, and I think it's intentional, but I don't know. It could be half-baked. It could just all be in my head. Let me know what you think. So yeah, this is now my new longest video, and I can say this time that I really did enjoy this story. It's really fun, and like every other story of George R. R. Martin's I've read, it's got a lot going on. If you made it to the end, please give me a like and subscribe. And please check out Birdchest's work. It is amazing. If my channel takes off and starts making money, I promise you guys I will commission a lot more from Birdchest. Thank you very much. Next week, we'll be talking about bitter blooms.